Hello, everyone, and welcome to another version of our Flight Operations Podcast. My name is Casey Meeks, Technical Standards Captain, joined by Chris Dillon, Airbus Program Standards Captain. Chris, how are you doing today?
Good. How about yourself, Casey?
Real good. Thanks, Chris. Hey, Chris, we've got a revision to Vol II. It's revision 79 coming out. Some pretty big changes in here, and we wanted to take a moment to discuss those changes. If you could kind of kick off and run us through the big ticket items here and what the crews can expect to see in this revision.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great, Casey. So to start off with, in the general limitations section, kind of the big ones, minus we won't go over the basic verbiage corrections, as it were. But one of the big ones that you'll see is on 205, page 6, where the maximum flaps and slat speeds has been changed. Primarily the policy, where we used to have VFE next minus 10 for flaps 1, 2, and 3, and VFE next minus 15 at flaps full. We've now gone VFE next minus 10 across the entire configuration set.
Okay, great. That makes it, I guess, easier to do the math as we're slowing down. So that's a welcome change, I'm sure. What was the reason for that change? Just to get it more closely aligned with Airbus recommendations?
Essentially, yes. We wanted to standardize it across. We worked very hard with FOQA to identify if VFE next minus 15 was even effective. And interestingly enough, we had a couple of good discussions and data analysis on VFE next minus 15 at flaps full was almost increasing potentially. It's not a direct correlation, but there's evidence that it could help correlate to flaps late setting at landing, because you can't get flaps full to 162 knots. And if you're asked to maintain 180 knots the final approach fix, it can get hard to lose that speed. So having it to VFE next minus 10 makes it more realistic at 167.
Sure. And I know you track a lot of the FOQA data. What are some of our big ticket items still for FOQA? What are you seeing most of all right now?
That's a great question, Casey. First off, FOQA's done a great job. They've taken the most raw data and taken the top 5 FOQA events right now, and from January to August. Mm-hmm. The top one is unstabilized approach, which probably is most realistically every airline. I believe we can get better, but we shouldn't be surprised by that one. Interestingly, though, the number 4 item is part of that unstabilized approach criteria, in that the 4th largest issue that we have with our crews right now is landing with the slats and flaps not in their set landing configuration by 1,000 feet.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So that could be attributed maybe to selecting flaps full at 1,000 feet, and if it's not completely set, it's going to set off a FOQA trigger at that time. Is that correct?
Exactly. Remember our stabilized approach criteria, and I'll go ahead and pull it up right here. The one thing that we really like to emphasize from the stabilized approach criteria is that in the landing, you have to be in the final landing configuration, meaning gear and flaps extended at 1,000 feet. So to your point, if you ask for flaps full at 1,000 feet, you're not going to meet that criteria. And as we kind of mentioned with this flaps full, you might be trying to meet our SOP of VFE next, and minus 10 is more realistic to meet both the policy and meet the needs of air traffic control.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Also there in the landing gear speeds, are we missing something here? Is there a change here? It's always hard when we take something out.
Yep. And interestingly enough, so right here is where we've always had just the speeds. In the flight control section, you'll notice one thing to your point that is missing, and that's the maximum landing gear extension altitude of 25,000 feet. That was one that whether Airbus had it or not in the past is well past my time here. But Airbus years ago did change that and remove the 25,000 feet. It's only a speed and Mach limitation. So it is essentially limited by altitude, but that's all dependent on your Mach.
On the Mach. Okay, great. So if I can be within that Mach margin, then I could extend the gear higher if absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and you've got a really good point there, Casey, where the Mach is, especially where we had the issues, is if you had departed out of, I'm just going to say Denver, and you had a really good climb rate, and all of a sudden your gear had gotten hot, maybe you had a dragging brake on takeoff, and you get up to that 24,000 feet, and you get the E-cam for the hot brakes, and it tells you to bring the gear down. Well, if our previous limitation of 25,000 feet was counterintuitive because the E-cam would give you the speed and Mach. So looking at the E-cam, It says you could drop the gear. So and you very well can.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for pointing that out. Another change that I saw that came through was the oil quantity limitations, and that one's kind of been back and forth. Can you show us what that one looks like and how we can apply this new procedure?
Yep, this one's a good one. And I'm really glad. It's obvious that it's been very effective that we've been getting these preview files out, because I've gotten quite a lot of emails directly from this one. The reason why, as you'll see, we've gone away from the 11 quarts plus 0.5 for every estimated hour of flight, and we've aligned with what the manufacturer recommends for engine oil quantities, simply because we were creating our own headaches and problems operationally by trying to manufacture new requirements. And I like to compare this to, you've got 2 cars in your household, right?
Yep.
I mean, as most of us do, and they're usually 2 different cars, 2 different types of engines, and we don't treat them both the same. Yeah. So we got to do that with the COs and NEOs. So what we are going to do is we're going to realign with exactly what the OEM recommends, where the CO aircraft will be at 9.5 plus 0.5 quarts per every estimated hour flight, and the NEO aircraft are going to go to what the OEM has, and that's 9.0 quarts plus 0.5 per every estimated hour of flight. But it's important to remember that it cannot dispatch below 10.6 quarts.
Okay. Except we have a note. This note at first glance is a little bit confusing. Can you describe what you mean by this? So if the airplane has been shut down for more than 60 minutes, it says I can decrease the required quantities from the above by 3 quarts to account for oil thermal expansion. Does that mean each of those figures you could subtract 3 from if it's met that condition?
Good question. No, it's only applicable to NEO aircraft, but let me give you 2 different examples, because this will kind of explain both why it says not below 10.6 and also the intention of that note. Great. So let's say you and I are going a flight from Denver to Salt Lake City. We know that's about an hour flight time. So we start off with our 9.0 quart as the base, and we have to add a half a quart because it's 1 hour flight time. That comes up with our calculation of 9.5. But in that case, I can't dispatch below 10.6 quarts, so I need to have 10.6 quarts indicating.
Okay.
Now, let's take the difference of a different flight where we're going Miami to Seattle. Nice long flight. So let's say it's 6 hours of flight time. You walk into that airplane, you need 9 quarts to start as your base. And then for 6 hours, you're going to have an additional 3 quarts of oil. So by math, we have to have 12.0 quarts indicated on the engine SD page. So notice that we're not using the 10.6, and that's really important that I wanted to emphasize. This picture is a picture perfect example of why we needed to change from the 11, because if we use 10.6 as the base and I added the 3, it'd show 13.6, and that's actually over 1.5 quarts more than that airplane really needed.
Okay.
So that's the reason why we separated the NEOs versus the COs. Now, the big thing about the note, the way that the NEO engine hangs, it's susceptible to oil expansion and contraction due to warm and cold oil. So in either of our examples, whether in the Salt Lake example where we needed 10.6 quarts or the Seattle example where we needed 12 quarts, we can reduce that quantity by up to 3 quarts to account for oil thermal expansion. What that means is that, say that flight landed in either of the locations overnight, maintenance walked up and they said, hey, I look at my task card, it does not need oil because that's still warm oil. Next morning, you and I walk up to that airplane and it may show that instead of, for example, the Miami to Seattle example where we needed 12, maybe we show up and it shows 11.5 because the oil cooled and it contracted. There's no correction on the engine SD page, so we can take a credit for that by up to 3 quarts.
Okay, great. So just so I understand this, on a short flight that would normally require 9.5 quarts, that Salt Lake example, but it's been sitting all night long, what I really need at a minimum is 7.6 quarts to account for the aircraft sitting, and really using that as my new minimum for the NEO.
Exactly. And Casey, to your point, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I know a lot of pilots listening to this and ironically also doing the math on their own, is their eyes are going to get huge. Oh my gosh, 7.6. But you've been here. How long have you been here, Casey?
19 years.
19 years. And
Yeah.
in that time, have you ever seen an engine at 7.6 quarts when you got into the airplane?
No, no, never.
And see, and that's exactly what I like to emphasize. We changed and aligned with the operator, but maintenance hasn't changed their task cards.
Hmm.
So they still fill it at the appropriate time. They still check it at the appropriate time. That example where I gave you where the airplane comes in realistically where it's above the required quantity to fill, and then it contracts overnight where we see it slightly off may be an example. But in the examples that we've used with maintenance, most of the time, by far, maintenance comes up to the airplane when it never needed oil in the first place, meaning we were aligning that 11 quarts and we only needed 12, but by our old SOP we needed 13 or 14. So I really like to emphasize nothing's going to change December 1st from November 28th.
Okay, great. And Chris, this is in limitation section, but I think you also changed the normal procedure to reflect this same change in expectation and policy for oil. Is that correct?
Yep, great point. Yep, we did align that, the engine oil quantity, both in the normal procedure as well as the limitations.
Okay, great. And then we still have the NEO issue, we call it, right, where we still have to turn on the FADEC ground power on the NEOs to be able to see that quantity.
Yep, exactly. If it's shut down for more than 5 minutes, you're going to have to do that. And again, to that point, we always use that maintenance ground power push button switch where we got to stretch out our arms for that.
Sure. You got to explain that to me. Was that an oversight or a design feature there? Is that ever going to change, or is that something we're just going to do forever?
No, it's the way the aircraft will have to be for the remainder, unless they find a way to cool the FADEC. The way that the FADEC and the EECs can collect engine data, they were finding that during certification, the EECs were overheating, and that's why they said during the ground operations, after 5 minutes, they're going to power down so they avoid overheating.
Cool. Well, hey, thanks for that explanation. That at least makes me understand why I'm pushing the button every time.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Let's see. Other normal procedures. Looks like there's some expanded guidance on how to appropriately align the ADIRUs when there's no GPS position. Can you describe that situation for me?
Yeah, Casey. So we had a lot of responses from this GPS issue we're having right now. As we know, the known problem with the GPS position being lost. And one of the things that we put out in the bulletin, and we also had this issue when we had that wrong MEL where we were required to deselect the GPSs even when one GPS wasn't operative. And a lot of pilots would say, well, when I need to align the ADIRUs via the gate coordinates, how do I adjust the ADIRU position on the reference position? So it was a good point, and there was enough people asking about it. So we added additional guidance in the normal procedures. It actually came directly from Airbus that you have a little bit more guidance to help you out get those positions accurate.
Okay, great. And then it looks like another removal, which these are always hard to capture. The removal of the need for the first officer to perform the doors verified PA. Can you show me where that used to be and the expectation now when we pull into the gate?
Yep. And again, this is just proof in the pudding of why this preview option has been so substantial. I've been getting a lot of questions about this. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the current SOP that will change on November 30th, right around 9 a.m. Denver time.
Okay.
Right now, it says the slides, the cabin signal will be given by the first officer, like we know, with the doors verified call.
Great.
This is what you're seeing now is the new procedure where, if you noticed, after the yellow electric pump, we're going to go ahead and do the parking checklist. The first officer will no longer be doing the doors verified verification. Interesting background behind this. It started off about 2 months ago. The flight attendant group called us and said, hey, we're going to be aligning our doors arming and disarming procedures. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, we're going to go with the 321 procedure across all fleets. Okay. And I'm a huge fan of standardization. So I said, that sounds like a spectacular idea. The arming procedure doesn't change us because they still call us for the the cabin secure call. So we didn't need to worry about that one. But the disarming procedure was very interesting because what happens is there's so much verification by what happens when we get to the gate and we turn the seatbelt sign off. The flight attendant A will call and make their announcement saying, hey, prepare all the doors, and then we'll do the all-call procedure. And I don't remember the specific verbiage, but that's what they do.
Yeah.
And then During that time, one flight attendant will disarm the door. Another flight attendant in the back will verify that door is disarmed, and they'll do the same thing for the other side. And then if it's the 321, obviously they'll disarm the middle doors as well. But the key is that then after that, they do this all call where they'll all verify by verbiage that, hey, I've disarmed both the doors. So now we've had a triple check essentially that the doors have been disarmed.
Sure.
The next verification is that the flight attendant A will then hang up and now look at the I'm sure they'll actually be on the phone still. Excuse me, they'll still be on the phone. Mm-hmm. She or he will look at the flight attendant panel and verify that there is no indications of doors being armed. And that's where the interesting discussion came up with the flight attendants. They said, we'd really like to get rid of the doors verified by the pilots because of all those verifications. Right. I validated, one, their procedure. Two, the indication on the flight attendant panel is the exact same source data that comes from the doors SD page. So they're looking at the same information. And then I called other airlines in the industry, and other airlines do the exact same thing. It's not a pilot responsibility to disarm the doors. So let's take it off of us and let's do our job. They'll do their job. And even ASAP data in the background. We did a lot of data hunting in this. No ASAP that was a door deployment, an inadvertent door deployment, was caused by this procedure, nor could have been averted by this procedure. Normally, they were due to very strange events where the door was left armed on accident, or a repositioned flight on accident. So
okay,
I really do believe this was a better procedure for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Let's see, in the abnormals and emergency procedures, it looks like there's been some clarifications to the philosophy, the management of abnormal operations. Can you hit on that for me, Chris?
Absolutely, Casey. So quite simply, the first thing we needed to do was just clarify. Someone brought up a good point of, we don't talk about the layer 2 information in the abnormal and emergency procedures section, the QRH. So we wanted to add a little bit more verbiage to make it very clear that during the abnormal operations, remember, it's memory items, then you're going to follow up with any applicable OEBs, and then you're going to follow the ECAM. After the ECAM, the next step in management of abnormal operations is the QRH. But it's not just a manual QRH, it's two different sections. One section, the QRH procedures section, the way I like to explain this to everyone is this is essentially an extension of the ECAM. These are procedures that are must know. We got to know to safely get the airplane on the ground, but they weren't ECAM procedures. For example, engine relight in flight or dual engine failure. You're not going to have all that procedure on the ECAM, but they're must know information. So we got to reference that section right away before continuing the flight. The next section, the abnormal and emergency procedures section, that's that yellow tab if we use the paper QRH, which I much more prefer the digital. It's easier to use. But we check that. That's the it's all the ECAMs you could get. And the reason we're going there is for that layer 2 information, the normal and italicized text, because that gives us that nice to know information. And I like to emphasize, yes, we don't reference that when we're going to delay an imminent landing, but it's still really, really good and useful information. You'd be surprised if we start using this to the exact capability it is. We have a lot of tools in our bag, essentially, to have really good decision making in any abnormal condition.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. That's a great point, Chris. Thank you. In the supplemental procedures, it looks like you just added, again, that procedure for the ADIRU alignment that we talked about in the normals section as well, but just some expanded verbiage on that so we can get through the entire process. Is that correct?
Exactly. We did an audit of Airbus and we were missing a few key things, so we just made sure we aligned with the OEM.
Okay, great. Hey, Chris, if we jump over to profiles, it looks like a big expansion for constant path angle, but as I read through it, it's really not right. Why did this look like it gets so much bigger, but it's the same data?
The information is directly extracted from the bulletin that we had living in the back of the manual for years.
Right.
And that the intention of bulletins, right, is to put it out until we do the next revision and we can incorporate it. And that's what we're working on right now in Vol II, is incorporating all these bulletins so that the procedures in constant path angles haven't necessarily changed except for one minor thing. But for the most part, it's just that information. As you can see, we added all the additional profiles that you saw in the bulletin section to explain how to do a constant path angle.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. But as you did point out, there is a very slight change. It's kind of an important change to understand when doing a non-precision approach and changing the verbiage. What was that change?
A couple of different changes. So especially in constant path angles, if you remember what we have today and what will change on the 30th, is that we used to say you have to be fully configured and at the final approach speed, the managed speed, by the final approach fix. That was not a realistic SOP, and it wasn't even necessary. Now, what we've changed it to, if you look at the first bullet under procedure for flying constant angle approaches, it says it is recommended to be fully configured by the final approach fix. And that's and we're using the right terms, early stabilized approach technique, and that's the most successful technique for those not 100% confident in the managed selected approach way. Because remember, if we do a selected descent in FPA, when we start configuring, the FPA will not go back and chase your profile down like it does on an ILS.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. And then as I approach the bottom of a non-precision approach, right, it seems like the verbiage there changed a little bit to give me an allowance to say continuing if I have the approach lights in sight down to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. Is that correct?
Yep, we did align all approaches to essentially meet the same exact as a precision approach, ILS.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't anything new. It's actually aligned with the regulations that changed years ago. And this was important because if you do the math off of the minimum approach or the MDA, DDA, or that we were flying, excuse me, DA or DDA, geez, MDA doesn't exist for us anymore, right?
Must do arithmetic.
Yes, exactly. So the big key was that we were trying to do these approaches, and we were saying that we had to have the runway instead of we had to go missed. Any of the approaches, the way that TURPS designs approaches now, if it has a runway approach light system, even on non-precision approaches, it's using that to help you get lower. So if you did the math, a great example in Denver, ILS 16 left, do the math, you're going to be over a mile away from the runway, and the visibility is only required to be a half a mile.
Right.
So we needed to allow for the continuing landing or go around at minimums.
Okay, great. So we might get continuing, and then really at some point when I see the runway, we would still follow up with a landing call when we actually saw the runway environment. Is that appropriate?
Exactly. That way, that eliminates the need for the pilot monitoring to continue to monitor for the 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. The minute that he or she hears landing, they know they've avoided any other calls. But until then, they're concerned about that 100 feet above touchdown zone, because at that point, whether it be an auto call at 100 or if not made, the first officer will make it, they'll have to call go around. Okay,
great. Let's see, Chris, performance section. Looks like the SAFO reference changed, and we're going to do a little different math now. What's that going to look like for me?
Yep. So we used to reference a SAFO back in 2006 that has been revised and updated in 2019. The SAFO recommendation got a little bit more specific in landing distance, specifically the flare portion. Interestingly enough, when Airbus was certifying the NEO, they actually were a little bit farther. If I remember right, it was around the 2016 time. They updated their landing performance to be a little bit more, well, I should say specifically more accurate on the flare distance, to a point of it was enough to have the flare distance, the landing distance rollout, and the 15% safety margin. So because of that, we're going to align with what Aerodata is already calculating when we do landing distance performance. Is it's going to have the calculated unfactored landing distance plus the 15% SAFO, or what I like to more call now the safety margin factor.
Okay, great. So no reason to add that 500 feet on top of the 15% now.
Nope, and that's all simply because, remember, and one thing I want to emphasize, and we're going to provide more guidance in the future with, is that flare allowance. The flare allowance is very accurate now because it plans on always crossing the threshold at 50 feet, flaring for 7 seconds, and along that 7 seconds, you're at 98% of your approach speed. And then you'll touch down after that 7 seconds at 96% of VAP. So that, as you can tell by all that exact measurement, your flare distance changes between flaps 3, flaps full, any failure, any ground speed mini. So it's just no reason to add that 500 feet on top of it anymore.
Perfect. Oh, that's great, Chris. Let's see, bulletins, some changes to bulletins. And you said there's obviously, we're trying to get bulletins out and put them in the verbiage of the operating manuals, which I think is great. Do you have a bulletin for incorporating how maintenance marks some QRHs when an OEB is removed? Is that right?
Yep. So to your point, we're on an endeavor to remove as many of the bulletins, including the Airbus industry bulletins, over the next couple of revisions. We were able to remove quite a lot of them, as you'll see, especially the flight operations bulletins in this revision. We did add in that, ironically, the bulletin that we had about the OEB removal process for OEB 48, the
Sure.
abnormal B alpha prot. And the reason being is really when we fix an airplane and an OEB no longer applies to an airplane, we need to let the crews know. And unfortunately, we're still right now in that paper world of the QRH. So it's hard to make sure that we get the airplane fixed and then coordinate an OEB replacement. Mm-hmm. So for OEB 48, immediately after maintenance, at the last part of their task card is to put exactly like you see on your screen, the markings across the OEB. And then I'll go back and start issuing the OEB, the QRH for the new airplane, which could take a couple of weeks.
Sure.
But, I am happy to say that OEB 48, we actually, today is the 20th of November, our very first airplane ship 701 just got the update to the ELAC, and 710 will be next week. So you'll start seeing those aircraft that are affected by OEB 48 start getting these marks and slowly be removed.
Excellent. Okay. Great. Thanks, Chris. Hey, Chris, I think it's fascinating as we sit here and talk about all these changes. You know, we see a change on paper, but it's fascinating to understand how much work and thought goes into the process of making these changes. And I really appreciate everything you do to keep us on track. That's a huge task, and it doesn't go unnoticed. So thank you very much for all that. We sure appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. And I always appreciate the feedback. You know, this Vol II revision, the way that we're doing the preview, has provided a lot of good guidance. And as always, the feedback that we get throughout the year has been incredibly helpful in making sure our manual becomes accurate.
Excellent. Great. Well, hey, Chris, thanks for your time tonight. I appreciate everything, and we'll talk to you and see you out there on the line soon.
Sounds great. Thank you, Casey.